Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure to have you here. This is a webinar called Rethinking Responses to Hostage Diplomacy, a collaborative approach to policy, strategy, and practice. And it is launching the Journal of Policing, Intelligence, and Counter Terrorism's special issue on state hostage taking or hostage diplomacy. This panel is a collaboration between Macquarie University and the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights in Canada. And we have three fantastic panelists who are also authors on the special issue of the journal joining us today. The journal itself was designed to bring together leading scholars and policy experts in hostage diplomacy and arbitrary detention from around the world. So we're really looking forward to having a discussion, not just about the academic or theoretical side of this phenomenon of hostage diplomacy, but also the policy side and the real world practical implications as well. So my name's Kylie Moore-Gilbert. I'm the editor of the special issue and I work at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. And I'm also a author and a co-author in the journal today. I will briefly introduce our three wonderful panelists, and I really encourage you to go and seek out their papers in the special issue of the journal and have a read if you haven't already. The way that things will work today is that we'll have about half an hour of discussion and question and answer between the panelists. And then the second half of the webinar will be Q&A from audience members. So don't forget to pop your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom here, and we'll get to them in about half an hour's time. You can write those questions as we go, or you can pop them in half an hour, that's fine. Just noting also that this will be recorded and distributed for those of you who aren't able to join live, and acknowledging that the time zone is pretty tricky for those of you based in Europe and the UK. So just keep that in mind as well. So today on this wonderful panel joining us, we have Brandon Silver, who's an international human rights lawyer and director of policy and projects at the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights. And he's also the chief advisor to Irwin Cotler, the former Canadian Minister of Justice and Attorney General. And Brandon and Irwin both co-authored a paper for the special issue titled Establishing a Multilateral Rapid Response Mechanism for Hostage Crises. We have Sophie Hunter, who's a policy professional who spent several years working in the United Nations on policy formation and development, including in energy transition and developing economies. In 2025, she gained first-hand experience navigating an international hostage diplomacy case while serving as the chief advocate for the release of a family member detained in Venezuela. And she drew on both her policy background and this lived experience to write her paper for the special issue titled From Petro-Coercion to Hostage Economics, Wrongful Detention of Statecraft in the Venezuelan Sanctions Regime. And it's a really interesting paper. I'd urge you all to take a look. And finally, we have Dr. Dara Conduit, who is a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Melbourne. Dara is known for her research on authoritarian regimes and digital autocracy, and is also an expert on Iran and Syria. Like our other panelists, Dara's also got lived experience of hostage diplomacy, as she was one of the leaders of the Australian campaign to bring me home from prison in Iran. Dara and I co-authored a research piece for this special issue titled Hostage Taking or Hostage Making, the Case for Prioritising Outcomes in Identifying and Modelling Hostage Diplomacy. So thank you to all three of you for joining us today. It's going to be a really interesting discussion. Maybe, Brendan, I'll start with you. Now, your paper, co-authored with Irwin Cotler, discusses a multilateral rapid response mechanism for hostage crises, which is a really interesting idea. Would you be able to outline more broadly what that mechanism entails?
Sure. Well, firstly, Kylie, thank you for this very timely and important initiative, which, as you mentioned at the outset, is anchored not only in a depth of expertise, but in lived experience from you and from fellow co-panelists. And it's a privilege to be here with you and speak a bit about the article published with Professor Kotler, which at first I want to reference where the recommendations emerged from. That as we were serving as counsel to political prisoners around the world, to hostages, we were witnessing a sort of reactionary ad hoc approach from states with a resurgent authoritarianism and a concomitant rise in hostage taking by states and their proxies. We saw, in October 7th, 2023, the largest international hostage crisis in modern history, where over 250 people from over 25 different nationalities were taken hostage. And then in 2024, we saw the largest prisoner exchange east-west since the Cold War, where Putin's spies and killers were traded for foreign hostages and Russian dissidents. And despite these major shifts, there has been no coordinated joint strategy on the part of Western democracies, which has led to a sort of collective action issue and allowing our adversaries to play us against each other. And there were some natural gaps that we witnessed in various hostage crises, regardless of region or issue. And the four recommendations we put forward was that there be coordinated sanctions, that implementation by one member state of a rapid response mechanism would entail action from all of them. Because if it's only one country engaging in sanctions, then you could easily have asset flight. It doesn't have the same rhetorical value. But if suddenly the world's major economies, major diplomatic hubs are jointly taking action, it shuts down the ability of these bad actors to operate and sends a powerful message of solidarity with victims and of accountability to perpetrators. And clearly, the hostage takers care about these sorts of things. The first time and only time there's been targeted sanctions for hostage taking was in the case of Vladimir Kara-Murza, the Russian Democratic opposition leader and journalist who was exchanged in that East-West Russia prisoner swap. It was only done in his case, and it hasn't been done since. But it was effective in ensuring he was included and released. So we want to expand upon that, and it was done sequentially. So rather than coordinated, we had to, following Vladimir's brave wife Evgenia, had to go around the world and encourage countries. Evgenia had to personally advocate that Canada, U.S., U.K., Australia undertake these sanctions. If there's a standing mechanism, it could be automatic and it could be effective. Secondly, law enforcement coordination. So right now, really only the United States is pursuing charges, international arrest warrants against perpetrators of hostage taking. This could have an important deterrent effect. It also protects national security. The Joint Task Force for October 7th, for example, actually found hostage takers who later had escaped their home jurisdiction and illegally and untruthfully sought refuge in the United States. So they're currently being prosecuted based on information provided by hostage survivors and family members. So again, this helps reinforce international norms. It helps protect national security against the corrosive effect of having hostage takers seek refuge in our own jurisdictions, and it gives victims a voice in sharing their stories. And it shouldn't only be the United States that are pursuing these sorts of things. So we encourage that national jurisdictions set up these sort of mechanisms and then coordinate jointly, joint law enforcement initiatives, joint prosecutions, and the like. And not to take up too much time, but to quickly reference two other recommendations, which are joint diplomatic action. Things like joint statements calling for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, action at the United Nations or regional multilateral forums. These sorts of things, again, tend to emerge in an ad hoc way and takes up a lot of diplomatic bandwidth each time a hostage crisis emerges. But if there is a standard forum format template that countries can pursue where there are clearly identified points of contact in each jurisdiction about how these statements and actions should be pursued, it could not only save time but save lives. For example, after October 7th, it took 6 months to simply get a statement saying hostage taking is illegal and they should be released, not because there was a lack of will or of interest, but simply because of disorganization. And again, if there was a standard format and mechanism, that could put important pressure on the bad guys, solidarity with the victims, and get things moving. And finally, which I think ties it all together, the fourth recommendation of our proposal is for sharing of best practices. Nobody knows these experiences better than the family members and those who've been through the ordeal of a hostage taking, but yet we found that in government decision making, these voices are excluded. So having regular gatherings where former hostages, family members of hostages, and legal and policy experts that can engage with government would be an important platform. And moreover, another issue we came across is that because of the nature of diplomatic rotations, when someone gets an expertise in their particular file, if a government did assign somebody to work on hostage issues, they end up being cycled out, and a new staff person has to relearn the issues, re-engage with stakeholders. So having the ability for there to be continual education and ties building with stakeholders can be important. But with those four recommendations, we sought that it be anchored in not a new international organization, but existing infrastructure. So we modeled it on things that have been done before, that were mindful of resource constraints. So something that could be cost effective, that would simply be responsive to secondments and in-kind contributions. So Canada, for example, in 2018 set up the rapid response mechanism within the G7 on democracy. And it still functions to today. Whenever there's foreign election interference, transnational oppression, they issue statements, they conduct studies, they coordinate action. It's effective, it's quick, and it's been sustainable, and it did not require much resources. So we propose that whether it's within the G7 or another forum of like-minded states such as NATO or OSCE, though we do think G7 is a tailor-made platform, because I think the majority of hostages globally actually emerge from the G7, and these countries have the bandwidth to pursue these sorts of actions. That's simply to say, look, we have a forum here that we're going to start coordinating sanctions, law enforcement, diplomatic statements, and sharing of best practices within the G7 in a sort of sub-working group to deal with these issues is a practical next step, and our article sets out exactly how governments can do so.
It's such a fantastic idea, and honestly, like, it almost seems utopian to get such a thing established, but I do think it's really, really needed, whatever forum it's headquartered in. I just wanted to quickly, as a follow-up question, build on this to ask you about the 2021 Declaration Against Hostage Taking and State-to-State Relations. I mean, my understanding was that initially in that declaration, which obviously was driven by Canada, there was sort of an idea of maybe having a smaller grouping of states to actually work on some of the mechanisms or some of the ideas you proposed in your article, but not much progress has really occurred there beyond the symbolic. I mean, do you think that that potentially could have been or still could be a venue or a place for such a grouping to push through similar changes to what you're or policy developments that you're recommending? And do you think that the kind of lack of progress on that declaration and making it into something that's beyond the symbolic indicates that it's sort of fallen off the agenda a bit internationally?
Well, I mean, the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention State-to-State Relations has received over 80 country endorsements, and it continues to grow, which is an encouraging sign. But I don't think the problem was ever really in a recognition that this is a crime. The Declaration restates international laws and principles that hostage taking is a grave international crime. The problem is in enforceability and coordinating states to actually combat it. So while it's a great starting point, perhaps it may not have progressed into formal deterrence or coordination mechanisms, because while a group of 80 plus states sends a powerful message rhetorically, it could also become quite unwieldy substantively in terms of, process and action, which is why our suggested path forward is to have a smaller core group of like-minded states that have a real vested interest in this and also the resources to back it up. That it wouldn't be caught in equivocation or process, but rather a sense of urgency and action. And again, whether it's the G7 or a sort of more national security oriented body like NATO, these are action oriented venues that have regularly established meetings. it also, again, if we were to anchor it in some other forum like the Declaration, it requires convening, capacity building, and the like. Whereas our suggestion of an existing of creating a working group in an existing forum means heads of government are already meeting in the G7. They've got the foreign ministers' meetings, the finance ministers' meetings, and these sorts of working groups have been set up before, as I mentioned previously, on democracy. So I think while it's certainly not a panacea, I believe that it's not necessarily utopian in its goal. Hopefully, in its effect. I think if it's done right, it can help a lot of folks, but it requires government investment. Your point about prioritization, I think if there was a meaningful effort, not in resourcing, because again, this could be done with limited resources. It requires political capital for whoever's hosting the next G7, which I believe is the United States, to say, we want this on the agenda. And the same way Canada in 2018 in Charlevoix said threats to democracy is an agenda item, we're going to create this sub-working group, and every other G7 country contributed. The next host, the United States, can say, we're prioritizing this and we're asking the other members to make a contribution, set up this working group. I think that's what it would require. And again, a core group of seven well-resourced and effective states could perhaps be far more expeditious and effective than a group of, I believe now, 82, which includes some states that are not necessarily rule of law compliant.
Yeah, I've long sort of thought that myself, actually. It's very, very interesting. Perhaps we should move on to Sophie, but I'd like to pick up some of the points you made maybe in the Q&A afterwards. So if anyone has a question to ask Brandon on many of the multitude, policy ideas he's just put forward, please pop that in the Q&A. Sophie, let's move on to you. So your article was really, really interesting, and it's obviously focused on Venezuela, but you sort of coined this term hostage economics, which is basically the main analytical framework of the article. So can you please just explain a little bit by what you meant by hostage economics and petro coercion within the thrust of your article? And also, as the world moves away from oil and competition over other resources like critical minerals intensifies, how should we think about wrongful detention as part of future geopolitical bargaining in that context?
Thank you so much, Kylie, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to hear that a lot of the points I've addressed in my paper have been mentioned by Brendan. So the issue of enforceability, I have a lived case of seeing the tension and different vested interests between the US and France. And so that's how I can really echo Brendan's recommendations. However, I think it will take a lot of time for it to be implemented. Sadly, for the families of wrongful detainees. So my paper, in essence, asks a simple question, which is why are we seeing more cases of wrongful detention by authoritarian states? And why are they increasingly occurring in countries under heavy economic sanctions? And this is how I thought about this concept of hostage economics when I was dealing with this wrongful detention case close to home. I believe that we often think of hostage diplomacy as primarily a legal or a human rights issue, which of course it is. However, I argue that it's also useful to think about it as an economic and geopolitical phenomenon as well. So in my article, I introduced the concept of hostage economics. The idea isn't that states suddenly decide to arrest foreigners because there are sanctions. Rather, sanctions and economic pressure change the environment and the dynamics in which wrongful detention becomes politically valuable. Most importantly, I am not arguing that there is some kind of master plan and that every detention is strategically designed from the outset. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So many detentions begin because of domestic repression, bureaucratic dysfunction, or security dynamics. But once a foreign national has been detained, that detention can become politically significant. It enters diplomatic negotiations, it attracts international attention, and it changes the whole incentives of governments on both sides. So in other words, the bargaining value of the wrongful detainee And the foreign national emerges through the interaction between the two governments and the price of the hostage increases or decreases based on the various economic interaction. So I call this process hostage economics because it helps to explain how individuals can become embedded within broader negotiations over sanctions, energy policy, international relations, without assuming a single centrally coordinated strategy. So my paper takes the lens of a French-American national who was detained for 7 months, and tracing how this one detention from this individual gradually became intertwined with wider diplomatic engagement between the US and Venezuela, especially over economic sanction and oil sanction and pressure from the US government regarding the oil sanction. So in essence, it wasn't just a single exchange or concession that was given by the US government, but it was the way that the detention became part of a broader diplomatic landscape as part of this game between the various incentives that were used to try to release this one French American as well as the other American. So as a bit of context about Venezuela, Venezuela has experienced the collapse of its oil revenues while also facing increasingly restrictive sanctions over the past 20 years. So historically, oil gave the state economic influence and bargaining capacity. As those traditional sources of leverage declined, wrongful detention of foreign nationals, especially Americans, increasingly became intertwined with negotiations and energy policy. So this leads to what I think is the most difficult policy dilemma. Democracies have a moral obligation to bring their citizens home, but every successful negotiation also risks reinforcing the expectation that wrongful detention is an effective way to gain diplomatic attention, as Brendan mentioned. So this creates a tension between securing today's release and reducing tomorrow's incentive through effective deterrence programs, which are currently lacking, especially as Brendan mentioned, the collaboration between country, joint statements. I never managed to get a French-American joint statement about the case of my brother, and I tried very hard. So I was very disappointed to see diplomacy in action that failed in that sense. So I think there's no easy answer, but understanding wrongful detention not only as a legal violation, but also as a form of coercive statecraft shaped by economic and geopolitical pressures gives us a better foundation for developing a more effective international response. And another I point out in the paper is that with all the pressures, economic pressures related to energy transition, my concern is that authoritarian states facing declining resources, revenues, especially in Asia Pacific, or increasing economic isolation, may look for other alternatives to create bargaining power, and that could be achieved through wrongful detention. So I think hostage economics isn't about today's sanctions or today's conflicts. It's about understanding how coercive bargaining may evolve as a global economy undergoes one of the largest energy transition in modern history. That means hostage diplomacy should no longer be viewed only as a human rights issue or a diplomatic issue, but it's increasingly a question related to economic security, energy security, and strategic resilience. Thank you, Kylie.
Oh, that's so interesting. And there's so much I could pull out from that as well. But just in the interest of time, I'm going to move to Dara and hopefully, again, please put questions in the Q&A for Sophie because there's so much we could discuss there as well. And it's such a fascinating concept. In a way, there's something of a commonality with Dara's article in this point that you were making about whether states have this intention from the outset to take a hostage and instrumentalize them and into a bargaining chip, or whether it just evolves that way because of other policy settings and other behaviors of that regime. Dara, your paper makes this interesting distinction between hostage taking and hostage making, and also grapples with the difficulty of identifying cases, particularly when they're ongoing. Could you tell us a little bit about those two topics that our paper has identified, and which form is more prevalent according to the cases that you've examined?
Yeah, of course, no problem. So I guess the premise of our paper is that we can see, anecdotally that hostage diplomacy is getting, appears to be getting more common. It's more prominent. Policymakers, I think, are becoming more aware of it, but we really struggled to there is no real numerical sense of whether that's taking place. There's no data to back that it's become more common. And that's because, well, one, the data sets don't exist in full yet, but two, it's really hard to actually identify hostage diplomacy cases. And so we decided in our article to have a go at identifying how one can definitively identify when hostage diplomacy is taking place. And so we have a look at hostage diplomacy in its early stages, and particularly in its origins. And we find that actually hostage diplomacy isn't always evident at that point. It's not always evident at the point of arrest at the beginning. And that's where we introduce these concepts of hostage taking and hostage making. So there are overt cases of hostage taking. For example, the cases of the two Michaels, who were, taken hostage by China in direct response to Canada's decision to arrest the daughter of the Huawei CEO. There's the case of Olivier van der Castille, who was arrested in Iran in response to Belgium's arrest of an Iranian diplomat. And these are really overt cases of hostage diplomacy that were pretty evident to start with. But there are also minority cases from what we can see. And what we saw more of actually as we were going through the data was actually there are these other cases which appear to have more legitimate beginnings, or more, I guess, certainly not, international policy beginnings that also end up as hostage diplomacy cases. They're not premeditated like those cases, but they're cases that tend to opportunistically turn into hostage diplomacy. So we look at cases such as that of the American basketballer Brittany Griner, who was arrested in a Moscow airport in 2002 for possession of less than a gram of medically prescribed cannabis oil. This was not a premeditated case. This is not, this is not something I think that Moscow had necessarily been planning beforehand. But as that case played out, I think she was identified as someone who was valuable and someone who could become a useful hostage, and morphed into that. And she was eventually swapped, exchanged with, released in a prisoner exchange with America for a notorious arms trader. And the case is the same. There are many cases like this where people have committed, say, minor misdemeanor crimes, or somehow, fallen into the lap of authorities, and, ended up in jail for one reason or the other, and then end up, with time becoming hostages. So we argue that actually looking at the beginning stages of a hostage case is not actually that useful, because if you looked at Brittany Griner's case, or if you looked at Trevor Reed's case, or cases like that, or your case, in fact, Kylie, you wouldn't actually see that it was hostage diplomacy at the beginning. So we argue then that actually you need to look at outcomes of hostage diplomacy. It's the only way to actually definitively count these cases is by looking at the outcomes. And we identify three key categories, or a typology of three key outcomes that we can associate with the cases. So there are direct outcomes. So for example, there might be a financial transaction that's taken place in line with the release. So something like Jason Rezaian or Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe in Iran, who were released at the same time as massive transfers of money were transferred from their home states back to Iran. It could be the removal of sanctions, such as, in sort of dynamics that the case Sophie was talking about earlier. It could be prisoner swaps. Kylie, you yourself were released in a prisoner swap. Brittany Griner was released in a prisoner swap. So these are the direct cases that you can say, yep, this is clearly hostage diplomacy. There are indirect outcomes that you can see. So it might be neglecting to impose sanctions or enforce existing sanctions. It might be trade and investment opportunities. It might be high profile, delegations. For example, US national Matthew Todd, who was arrested in North Korea in 2014. was released after a high-level American delegation visited North Korea later that year. Uh, so, it could be indirect things like that. And the third outcome that we observed was no outcome at all. So it might be that a prisoner was released because it had become so politically problematic for the arresting country. It might be that they're released for health reasons, that this could be that this is going to become politically problematic because of their health situation, or maybe someone's completed their sentence. And so we argue that it's only if there is a direct or indirect outcome that is identified that we can actually identify hostage diplomacy. Because the murkiness of cases in the beginning and throughout, the secretiveness, the complexity, it's the only way that we can actually do it definitively. And because many people at the beginning of many hostages are not actually hostages when they begin. It only as their case plays out do they actually become hostages. So in some ways, it's an unsatisfying answer, particularly for policymakers who are constantly asked to respond to, individual hostage diplomacy cases as they're happening. And I think, Kylie, when we started this article, we were hoping that we might be able to, identify some kind of mechanism, some sort of, key features that maybe, would help us to set off these kind of early alerts that Brandon was talking about. But I mean, we came to the conclusion that's the only way that we can properly account for the phenomenon and ensure data integrity is by focusing on the outcome. So I guess our article is not going to help, policymakers who are responding to live cases in the moment. But what we hope is that our article will support scholars and policymakers to build the large data sets we need to actually create these large and coordinated mechanisms, kind of what Brandon is talking about, to actually understand hostage diplomacy from a macro perspective. So I think it's still a valuable contribution, but it's certainly not helping, those who are in prison right this minute.
It's such an important point, and that very much stood out for me in writing the article as well. But I do think that it's a bit boring, but collecting data is really important. And it's very frustrating when governments that are affected by this again and again do not even disclose the identified statistics or the data of cases, case numbers, perpetrator state, nothing like this over time. And it's left to researchers and NGOs and others to sort of try and gather as many fragments and pieces as they can and put them together into a data set, when we know that if governments were a little bit more transparent, whilst not compromising on privacy, of course, there could be a much more robust data set out there that could be very, very helpful and useful in mapping trends and trying to, come up with policies to address the phenomenon. So at least hopefully our article contributes somewhat to that space. Please pop your questions into the chat function. Let's open it up for audience Q&A now. We've got a question from Zoe for Brandon. Mainly, it's really about the Trump presidency and whether or not whoever's in power in the White House at any given time would impact the proposals for a rapid response mechanism that you're putting forward.
Well, thankfully, it seems that these issues of combating hostage taking rise beyond the partisan fray in an increasingly fractious political environment. And if only we could marshal that bipartisanship into concrete action, would bring us closer to, having some of these initiatives actually implemented. And perhaps that's more of a question of elevating it, to a higher level of political engagement. But having said that, I mean, if you look at the previous examples of some of the large hostage deals, the Biden administration led some of the initial work on the diplomatic side for the October 7th victims, like the joint statement. We would not have gotten the joint diplomatic statement if not for the Biden White House stepping in and coordinating amongst all the foreign embassies in DC. And again, they stepped in at the request of hostage families, but commendably did so and wrangled all the foreign jurisdictions to jointly condemn hostage taking, which is an important statement to have made well beyond the victims of October 7th, and likewise for the East-West Russia prisoner exchange. And I think beyond the work the Biden administration did on those issues, the Trump administration has clearly prioritized combating hostage taking and secured the release of many Americans, regardless of their political views. So, you know, from what we've seen representing victims, it doesn't matter if someone's Democrat, Republican, unregistered, they're getting the same level of support from both, parties and administrations in both houses and in the White House. And I hope that that bodes well for the next G7, which will be chaired by the U.S. and whoever may hold power in the houses or in the White House, that would lend itself to some you know, uh, sustained action.
Yeah, that's really, in a way, it's almost the only kind of bipartisan policy left in the Trump administration is hostage policy, maybe. So that's good to hear. So if you're going back to your article, I've got a question here about the relationship between oil rent and hostage taking, because you also coined this term petro coercion, which is really interesting. So do you think you could expand a bit on that? I know you kind of did in your remarks earlier, but also just thinking about other oil and gas rich states that take hostages, and we've mentioned both Russia and Iran in our discussion as well. Do you think that your conclusions about Venezuela might apply to those states as well?
So I believe that my conclusions would apply. At the same time, they are quite specific to Venezuela. And just going back, following up from Brenda's point, I understand that the rapid response mechanism is it's a great initiative, it's a great tool. You also mentioned the declaration, the wrongful detention declaration, and a potential initiative with the G7. But I was just wondering if you could reply in them after my comment about Venezuela. How could you address the situation where two G7 countries have a very different take on a hostage case? So in my situation, the US government was extremely active and proactive, but the French government did not recognize the detention of the four nationals detained in Venezuela as wrongful detainees or anything, and they are still fighting in French courts to actually get this recognition. So I was wondering, it's great to have initiatives, but what about enforcing and making sure that those initiatives lead to concrete actions for families, because that's what they want. And going back to the question about petrol coercion, I do think that if you look at the cases of, for instance, Americans detained abroad, most of them have been detained in oil sanctioned or in countries with a very large portion of GDP, which is reserved for oil, and that's why it's a trend. And I do think that in the future it could get worse because of the pressure. This is why I mentioned, because of the pressure of the energy transition and the oil rent declining. So my conclusions regarding hostage economics and the concept applies to those other cases. However, in the case of Venezuela, I think it's even stronger because it's a country that has been sanctioned for many, many years, with no foreign impact. The EU has put a lot of sanction, and that was the leverage that the US government used to release the Americans, and for 10 years, it was always the leverage. But the problem is, if you continue to use this leverage, then Venezuela continued to actually seek out Americans, and also other foreigners, especially from Italy, France, and Spain, because of the oil infrastructure. Those companies have been based there. So it's a tension. It's very difficult to address, and that's why having a great deterrence program is it's extremely needed, and it's not the case either for the US or for the French government, which is extremely sad.
No, that's
Well,
yeah. Brendan, do you want to respond to Sophie's question?
sure, but I would start just by echoing the comment about the deterrence, and by recounting a story from my article's co-author, Professor Kotler, from back when he was representing Anatoly Sharansky in the Soviet days, and he had met Gorbachev later at a conference and wanted to know what in the course of advocacy, if anything at all, had led to his decision to release Sharansky. And Gorbachev had said, you know, I was Minister of Agriculture at the time. Wherever in the world I would be traveling to, when I'd be meeting with the Minister of Agriculture, when I'd be going to Parliament, there'd be protests, free Sharansky. In every meeting, they'd say, yes, we'll discuss agriculture, but first we want to talk about this arbitrary detention case. So that when he became premier, he called up Sharansky's file and said, who is this nuisance that everybody keeps raising with me? And looked at the file and said, ultimately, it's costing us far too much to keep this Sharansky in prison to release him. So for our own self-interest, we decided to set him free and allow him to leave. To your point, Dara, about releases that are ultimately done in a state's self-interest. That when the costs, the balance of scales shift in terms of effective deterrence, and that sort of underpins a lot of the recommendations in our proposal. So yes, as you suggested, Sophie, there may very well be disagreements amongst G7 members, and that might stymie some forms of concrete action. But I think wherever there can be coordination, conversations, that's a helpful starting point, because right now there isn't even a platform and forum for that. So ensuring that there's a standing infrastructure that allows for families to convey what they want to decision makers, where there are dedicated experts on the parts of government who are assigned to these roles, for those dedicated interlocutors to be able to engage with each other, and for where these places can be identified, that enough pressure, deterrence, and leverage can be undertaken to encourage behavior change on the part of the hostage takers. And where we've seen that targeted sanctions can have that effect, that joint statements can provide protective cover for those suffering in detention while shining a spotlight on the hostage takers. Many of those involved in these processes want to enjoy anonymity and obscurity. The judges and jailers, the police officers and prosecutors, having them named and shamed, ensuring that they can't travel to enjoy the freedoms abroad that they're denying hostages that they're holding. I think all those sorts of things can hopefully be a point of agreement amongst countries. And at the very least, just talking about them will get back to the hostage takers and hopefully rattle them to some degree. And we've seen in some cases that shot across the bow, just talking about these things, it tells the hostage takers that this is a liability, not leverage. And if we manage to do this at scale, get the world's biggest economies and diplomatic hubs to start coordinating with each other, even if only in conversation to start, but hopefully later in action, that'll be a step above the very arbitrary approach to arbitrary detention right now, that has not led to successful, in our view, to what could have been a sooner and more successful resolution to the seemingly more frequent hostage crises that continue to emerge.
No, that's such an important point. Kind of building on what Brandon was mentioning here, actually, and the anecdote from Professor Kotler regarding Gorbachev. Got a question in the chat for Dara about cases that you mentioned where there is no outcome, where through political pressure or just making it too difficult for that target country, or for the hostage taking country to hold on to that person, somebody is released without any discernible hostage outcome. Do you think that there is any pattern here? Are there anything in the data that you were looking at that shows maybe a model that states could pursue, maybe something similar to what Brandon was mentioning about just mentioning that person's name in every bilateral meeting or every trade meeting or any delegation that's sent to that country? I mean, were there any patterns that you saw that enabled states to try and prize free their detained citizen without having to give something up?
I mean, I think the no outcome category is complex, because some of these people may have been, potential hostages. They may, like somebody like Otto Warmbier, or some of those, cases, he was he was arrested in North Korea, or some of the, and perhaps the North Korean government did intend to extract something from the American government for his arrest. I mean, he committed the most minor of misdemeanors, but sadly he suffered a catastrophic brain injury while in prison. That he didn't recover from and was eventually transferred home. So I think there are some potential cases in the no outcome section that might be cases of hostage diplomacy, and we will never know. But the other cases in the no outcome section may just be cases of wrongful detention, arbitrary detention, political detention. And that's one of the problems we talk about in the article, is that actually, it's often very difficult to differentiate between, cases of arbitrary detention and hostage diplomacy. And that's why we make it very clear that you need to focus on the outcomes, because otherwise we end up blurring the lines between these things, and we end up treating people as hostages when they're actually not. So a lot of these cases, I'm sure, on cases of arbitrary detention, governments also advocate very strongly for them. And maybe those cases were never going to be hostages either.
Yeah, and often someone's a domestic political dissident who might happen to hold a foreign citizenship but has been arrested entirely because of their domestic political activism within that country. And, whatever that second country of nationality says or does, maybe it doesn't make a difference, because that target, is there because of domestic political reasons,
Yeah,
primarily.
and I think that's the important. That's why I think it's quite significant. The work we did around hostage making, the fact that there's nothing inevitable about someone becoming a hostage or not becoming a hostage. This is something that hostage taking states are. It's clear that hostage taking states are using the arrest of foreign nationals opportunistically. But the fact is that not every foreign national that is arrested by one of these states is going to become a hostage. Some of them, as we talk about, have actually committed crimes. Some of them, as you just mentioned, are political prisoners whose time in prison is more valuable domestically, to send a message to other dissidents, etc., than it is to extract some sort of foreign concession from them. So I think it's just really, we just have to be really careful. And that's why you and I came up with such a strict definition or a strict way of identifying cases of hostage diplomacy that will, as we say, no doubt lead to undercounting of some of these cases, but it's the only way we can actually do it in a way that preserves data integrity.
Yeah, that's an important point. And, there have been cases, particularly out of Iran, I'm thinking of, where the arresting state actually executes the person who has a foreign citizenship. Somebody like Jamshid Sharmat, who was a German Iranian dissident, for example, rather than give in to whatever offers Germany might have been making. I mean, I'm sure they were offering negotiation to try and repatriate him to Germany, for example, but the country actually executed or killed this person to send that message. So
Yeah,
it's
much more valuable domestically than internationally in this case. So
yeah, that's really important. We've got a question here. Maybe I'll just throw this to the group if anyone wants to jump in, about the credibility of using a nation's military capacity to recover detainees. I guess, I mean, the word credibility, I guess, is key there, and everybody thinks of the US, but maybe not just the US when they think of this. It's not, should the military step in and enact some kind of military operation to rescue hostages? We've seen that go awry. I think that the sort of data on that shows that that's a very risky option and often backfires on the hostage or that nation. But should, I guess, having that backup sort of understanding that they can flex their muscles militarily if need be, does that actually bolster the negotiations and a country standing in negotiating hostage releases? Would anyone like to jump in on that?
I can give some inputs into that. So when I was dealing with the wrongful detention case, I was told to strongly advocate to the US government and also to the French government, which has used its military forces, for instance, to try to recover unsuccessfully various hostages in Africa, to advocate not to use military action because the statistics, so it's the Global Reach Foundation that had this statistic of the likelihood of the hostage or the wrongful detainee to come out of the military operation alive is much slimmer. So I remember someone telling me, we need to go via the diplomatic route. It's going to take more time, but there's a higher chance that your brother will come out alive. So I had to strongly advocate to the State Department not to explore this option. I know that this option was on the table. And when I saw in the news, when I read in the news about the American Navy ships coming to Venezuela, I was extremely worried that this option was actually going to take place. So I think showing force could put pressure on the government. It did for Venezuela, but I think it's much more relevant and useful for a better outcome to use the diplomatic channels and pressure.
I think something else is that it's also not necessarily an obvious outcome for states. And we talk about this a little bit in our paper, but one of the reasons why it's so hard to find, to identify a case of hostage diplomacy is because it's often shrouded in this legalese and in this, this what appears to be, it's a veneer of a legitimate legal process. So, this person has committed a serious crime in our country and we are putting them through a court system. That's one of the defining features of hostage diplomacy is that, they have broken the law. And that makes it very, very challenging for the home state to respond because there are questions of state sovereignty and there are questions of, respecting the legal process in other countries, which means that, if this person has indeed committed a crime, and it's very, very difficult for the home state to identify that, particularly in the early stages, military options could be wildly inappropriate because in some cases, foreign nationals do commit grave crimes in foreign countries. So it's often, it's often not something that's thought of, I think, initially, well, because there's so much, it's such a gray area. It's so murky.
And there's so much sort of unintended consequences or, things that could happen that you spin off from that nobody can even predict. So it's a high risk option, I guess. Now, I just wanted to put this to the group as well, to pivot to a slightly different topic. And we've had Professor Carla Firstman contribute a really fascinating piece on reparations for victims of hostage diplomacy to the special issue, and I'd urge you all to go and take a look at that as well. And, hearing from Brandon, we don't have an international mechanism right now, and, sanctions are important, but there are limitations to them as well. Do you think target states should set up reparation schemes, perhaps not unilaterally or multilaterally, ideally, if that would work within the forum of the UN, to, similar to perhaps those offered to victims of terrorism, to offer reparations for victims of hostage taking or wrongful detention? Anybody like to take that one?
I can take it. So I believe it's very important for both for the victim and for the family members as well, of wrongful detainees to have some kind of reparation or acknowledgement by whichever states have been involved. So in my case, I'm fighting in French courts to get an acknowledgement from the French government, which is not admitting to the wrongful detention despite, and the French government has dismissed American evidence. So it's very interesting to see that there's a FBI letter saying that my brother was wrongfully detained. However, the French government is saying that no, maybe he was on holidays for 7 months. So I believe it's very important, and also it can act as a deterrence mechanism. So, for instance, in the case of Venezuela, one of the idea I put forward to the State Department was telling them, since there are a lot of American oil companies with interest or with presence in Venezuela, if those oil companies would pay a fraction of their oil revenues, like a tax, to a reparation fund, that could also act as deterrence both for Venezuela and also for the US. So that's an idea that is being discussed in Congress. And I hope it will come to light in the future. From the French side, there is a reparation fund. However, it's extremely difficult to prove. So in the case of my brother, he was never put on trial. There is no evidence. There is no legal evidence. So it's also an extra burden for families. So that's why there are two sides to the argument.
That's so interesting. Brandon, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, formalized mechanisms that could provide the recognition and reparations to make a victim whole is essential and often missing from these conversations. One of the Canadian sanctions components for targeted sanctions actually allows for the government to not only freeze, but to seize assets and then repurpose them for the benefit of victims. That hasn't ever been used in this way. But the way the law is written, it can be. Um, so you mentioned whether unilaterally or multilaterally. I think in the context of our, suggested proposal, this can indeed be done multilaterally, but we need not wait for that. I think any country that has the capacity to be repurposing frozen assets to whether pay it into a victims fund that is tailored for hostage victims or in a more ad hoc way, which, again, the Canadian legislation would allow for either in my reading of it. I would encourage that be explored in its own right now. And I imagine there are parallel mechanisms in other jurisdictions that have targeted sanctions laws. So if we would be pursuing sanctions against hostage takers, especially those that have assets in our jurisdictions, it would be poetic justice in a way for the assets and property of hostage takers to be seized and given to their victims in those jurisdictions or beyond. There's no effective legal argument against it. We're doing it with the oligarchs vis-a-vis Ukraine, and we should start doing it to the hostage takers too.
Absolutely. Dara?
That's a really good point, Brandon, that rather than taking, frozen state assets, take the frozen assets of the individuals involved in this, because that, will have a much more personal impact, I think, on deterring the individuals. Something that's always struck me about hostage diplomacy is just the injustice of it for those who become hostages. So people get stuck, individuals get stuck in these international disputes they literally have nothing to do with. This is the stuff of high politics that has nothing to do with, individual citizens. And yet they face these, life-altering consequences. So I think about, when you were in prison, Kylie, it was hidden for the first year. Nobody else, like the public, didn't know about it. And so two other young Australians traveled to Iran. They, were holidaying, taking a trip across West Asia. And so they traveled to Iran on this backpacking trip, Mark Firkin and Jolie King, not knowing that you were in prison, not knowing that there was currently a political situation between Iran and Australia. And so they traveled, I think they were Instagram influencers or something, they flew a drone and got themselves arrested, presumably to increase the pressure on our government, to negotiate and finalize your situation. And they hadn't, so they were dragged into this situation that they knew nothing about, they couldn't have known about. The Australian government was not being public about it. And so I think our states, home states, need to recognize the injustice that's being done too, and the huge cost of that, in terms of trauma, in terms of lost income, lost careers, personal hardships, the huge cost of like ongoing psychological support and stuff. So, sure, it was not the Australian government's fault that you were arrested or that they were arrested. Iran is obviously the ones at fault. And yes, frozen assets could be used. But it was the Australian government's policy and their international relations that got you into that situation. You walked into that situation without knowing because they hadn't made it public. As Brandon said, I think they have a responsibility to make you all whole again. They're not without fault.
That's such an important point. I wish we had more time to interrogate that further, but I think we've come to the end of our 1 hour panel session today. Thank you, all of you. It's been such a fantastic discussion, and thank you to you in the audience who are listening and who've posed all of these incredible questions to us as well. Well, now concludes our webinar. Thanks to everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kylie. Bye.